This session is on getting therapy to those who need it most. So jumping ahead, I'm going to read this. I said it in an interview a year ago, and I always forget exactly what I said, but I liked it. Smartphones have reduced in-person interactions. Technology has made it easier for people to communicate and harder for people to connect. As we become more disconnected from the world around us, we often lose our psychological support system. It's time we put technology to work for us as a tool to help people connect with one another. This is where typically we talk about ourselves. I find this slide to be really distasteful. It's a great tool to convince people not to ask questions and to think that the person on stage has all the answers. I don't have all the answers. In fact, I'm going to spend most of the time today talking about challenges within our industry, challenges associated with delivering services, and I'm hopeful that some of you out there are able to pick up some of those challenges and run with them. We're doing quite a bit at our company, LARKR, but if we had all the answers, we would have solved this problem already. Why do I do this? Why did I choose to work in this industry? Anybody recognize that slide? Pictures on that slide? Hands? Yeah, those are the kids that were shot at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. It happens to be a school that my older daughter attended for 3 years, a community that we're very close to. We started the company, we started working in this field quite a bit before that, but this is a shocking example of what can go wrong when services aren't available. And that's not to say that I believe that this issue was related to a mental health issue, but it is to say that I believe mental health care can have a meaningful impact on both preventing serious issues as well as helping deal with the outcome of those issues. So what to expect from this session? We'll talk a little bit about existing challenges, overcoming obstacles, some new technologies, and if there's time, we'll talk a little bit about our company as well. So I'll pause for a second, and feel free to scream things out. Who needs therapy the most? That is a great answer, everybody. At a lot of conferences and a lot of talks, I hear answers like Donald Trump. I hear answers like liberals, particularly when I'm speaking in the Northeast. I hear answers like my mom, my cousin, my kid, my dad, my coworker. Very rarely do I hear answers like me, right? It's pretty uncommon for somebody to say, you know what, I recognize that I need this type of help. So much so that, jumping ahead here for a second, there are somewhere between 50 and 85 million people in America dealing with mental, emotional, or behavioral issues, yet only about 20 million of them are receiving care. To put that in perspective, deck just froze up. But to put that in perspective, most of the time when people talk about this industry, they talk about how $500 billion a year are spent on mental health care and related services. They talk about how it's potentially a $1 to $2 trillion business opportunity. What they don't talk about is the fact that those people that are suffering from mental, emotional, or behavioral issues represent on the order of $6 billion in GDP, right? Which is effectively the economy of Japan. So we're not just up here talking about how do we build businesses, how do we support 50 to 85 million people. We're talking about how do we change the world in really meaningful ways. With that, anyone know how we get this unfrozen? I'm going to pause for a second and share a quick story. When I was 10 years old, I was in the backseat of the car. My mom was driving. My dad was sitting in the passenger seat, and we were in a car accident. Really bizarre story, actually. Somebody stole a car and T-boned us. The result of that accident was first everybody was okay. But it was particularly traumatic My mom was covered in blood. Her forehead took off the rearview mirror. My dad actually went into cardiac arrest. And here I was sitting in the back seat, covered in my mother's blood, watching my dad have a heart attack. You know, once we all got out of the car, got taken to the hospital, everything was fine. My parents tried to find me a therapist because I was afraid to get back into the car. I happened to have lived in a rural area in upstate New York. The nearest therapist, in fact, the two nearest therapists, had kids in my sister's class, and they weren't able to see me, right? So I share that story, one, because the deck was frozen, and two, because it's actually a really common story in this country, right? Roughly 50 to 60% of the US population has to travel 30 miles or more to see the nearest therapist eligible to treat them. We all, you know, tend to think this is a rapidly urbanizing environment. There's always therapists available, even if there's a bit of a wait in places like San Francisco or LA or New York City. But when we look at the fact that 50 to 60% of the US population lives in rural areas, in these rural areas, everybody knows each other. Their kids go to the same schools. They eat at the same restaurants. There can be real challenges with accessing a lot of that care. Just jumping along here a little bit, primary client roadblocks to accessing mental health care include cost. If you're not aware, the median cost of seeing a therapist in the US is about $150 a session. It could be significantly more, topping $300 a session in you know, certain high-density urban areas where there's high demand. Yet the average therapist is only taking home $22.50 after expenses. So there's a huge gap in expectations as well. Accessibility I talked a little bit about with my own personal story, but it doesn't just apply to rural areas. Inner city areas that are particularly impacted by stigma, for example, Black or Hispanic communities, there's a real challenge with accessibility. For teens and young adults, there's a real challenge with accessibility, right? If you're 15 years old and you're counting on mom or dad to take you to your appointment every 1 to 2 weeks, they have to take time off of work. You know, real challenges around that. And then the last point I'll bring up on accessibility is really around continuity of care. So if you're a teenager, say college-bound, how do you deal with continuity of care between, you know, summers at your parents' house, rest of the year on campus, right? So you know, continuity of care is really challenging. It's challenging not just for teens and young adults dealing with college, but also those dealing with entering the workforce, for example. Any kind of major life transition, moves from state to state, or even city to city can be a challenge there. And then the third area I'll touch on here is around stigma. So I'm going to pause there for a second, and I'd love to hear if someone wants to, you know, raise their hand, shout out. What do you believe stigma to be? What's your definition of stigma? Shame's a good one. Anyone else? Repercussions. So that's a really good one as well. So the way I define stigma is closer to the repercussion side of things. It's not so much that you are, you know, it's not so much that you feel bad or you feel shame associated with it. You know, in many cases, or the way I like to talk about it is that it's really about fear of how others are going to perceive you, right? Not necessarily how they're going to perceive you, because if you look at certain age groups, again, for example, the 13 to 24-year-old, very few teens and young adults actually perceive those who access mental health care to be less than. But there's a fear by you know, the individual that's in need that they will be perceived as less than, and that may be a very real fear with parents or grandparents or friends. It may be, a very artificial fear, with peers. So real quick story on the stigma side. I always like to relate it back to the first time you see a dentist. So most of us, probably all of us, were born in a hospital. We all know what it's like to see a doctor, right? From the day we're born, we know what it's like to see a doctor. We don't like getting shots, but we kind of get that we need to go there to get better. Most of us, at least me, never saw a dentist before 4, 5, 6 years old. We probably saw cartoons with big scary drills. We probably heard people talking about it as something that was very scary and foreign. We had a few years of experience to put behind us. By the time we went to that dentist, we were pretty terrified. But our parents knew how to choose a dentist, right? Because they had seen a dentist most of their lives, and they were there to hold our hand, right? They didn't view it as, hey, you're less than because you're seeing a dentist. They viewed it as, you just got to see a dentist, right? With mental health, in many cases, you're going 15 years, 20 years, 40 years, having never seen a professional. You don't know how to choose one. You don't have anybody around you that's going to hold your hand. At least most of us don't have anybody around us that's going to hold our hand and teach us how to choose a therapist, where to go, what to expect. So it can be really, really scary. Again, just moving ahead here, one of the big challenges that we have in this market is there's not that many therapists out there. We have, across the 51 different licensing bodies in the US, about 550,000 actively licensed therapists. Best estimates say that, call it, I think I wrote it on here, 40 to 70% are actually practicing. Now, why are so many therapists not practicing? A lot of it has to do with archaic licensing practices, right? You get licensed in California, you move to Florida. How do you work, right? The reciprocity process can take, in many cases, up to 3 years. My wife is here in the audience. She actually applied for reciprocity in a East Coast state and is waiting, a year now? No answer, right? So it can be really, really challenging. In addition, it's pretty hard to get licensed. So if you're somebody that changes fields, let's say goes into HR and isn't actively practicing any kind of mental health, in many cases you're going to maintain your licensure just in case, right? So at the end of the day, that leaves us with a potential client-to-therapist ratio, I have to look at the slide, of somewhere between 1 to 90 and 1 to 260, which is, for any therapist in the room, completely unfeasible, right? At least not with the current model. Geographic distribution of clients and therapists. I spoke one-on-one with a couple people today about some of the challenges related to geographic distribution and licensure. You get out of college, you go looking for a place to get your hours, to work as a registered intern. The reality is that if you're looking for a supervising therapist, most of them are going to be concentrated around urban areas, right? So if you are somebody that went to get licensed as a therapist because you want to go back to your hometown and provide services to your small rural community, good luck, right? You first have to go and spend several years working as a registered intern postgraduate school. Way too many people kind of settle into their lives within those environments and really concentrate around these urban areas. In addition to that, in a city of 20,000 people, you might only have a handful of therapists working in that city. As I mentioned earlier, it creates ethical challenges in terms of who you can treat. It leaves significant portions of the population effectively untreatable by those that are living in those areas. I won't go through all of these points in detail, But suffice it to say, geographic distribution is a real challenge. You couple that with the challenges around, around licensure, where you're licensed one state at a time, and huge swaths of population don't have access to good quality care. Next thing I'll mention as a real challenge is scheduling. So most therapists, if you're a therapist in the room, I'd love for you to raise your hand, but most therapists tend to like to work the same hours as everybody else, right? You get up in the morning, you do your job, you go home at night, you have dinner with your family. There's also challenges around cancellations, right? How do you ensure you have enough billable hours in the day to cover your expenses if you're seeing cancellations? The way that that's often dealt with is through overbooking. And then our own research has shown that the demand for psychiatric services tends to be greatest in the evening when people are alone, right? You get home from work, you finish your classes, whatever it happens to be, you're sitting alone in your apartment, and those times can be quite challenging. Matching. So as I mentioned earlier, clients don't often know how to choose the right therapist, right? The first time I tried to choose a therapist, I actually went and looked on Yelp, right? Not really a great way of finding somebody that's going to provide great services. I didn't even know what my problem was, right? I just wanted to go see a therapist, have them listen to what I had to say, and either tell me I was fine or give me a diagnosis. So Yelp, not really a great mechanism. Most of the matching services that are out there know little or nothing about you before they connect you with a therapist. More often than not, it's just somebody that has availability, right? Therapists rarely turn down a client in need, right? Even if it's not a great match, it's really hard to turn away somebody that needs help, doesn't know how to find it. And bad matches often lead to a variety of issues. In fact, statistically, almost 50% of clients will see a therapist no more than twice. And generally, it's because it was a bad match. They try it once, wasn't so good. They try it again, realize it's not for them. And the moment they say, therapy's not for me, all of a sudden, it's not an accessible tool, right? It's not something that they're going to take advantage of going forward. So matching is absolutely critical. Treatment plan. So not to pick on the therapist in the room, my wife is a therapist, but maybe I'll pick on her a little bit. But she's laughing. Often treatment plans are really poorly developed, really poorly executed, not iterated on well, because as a therapist, you don't really have the time to spend on doing it, right? You put together the treatment plan to deal with the realities of payment providers. You put together the treatment plan to deal with whatever legal realities you're dealing with in your jurisdiction. And then you kind of move on, right? You try to treat the client. But what that does is it removes kind of the feedback loop. It removes that tool for you as a therapist to understand what is and is not working well for that client over long periods of time, and adjust as necessary. Engagement between sessions. So like most things in life, you get what you give. I think most people in this room probably realize if therapy to you just means show up every 2 weeks for a 45 or 50-minute session, you're probably not going to make any really significant progress. A lot of therapists will assign homework, be it daily journaling, be it other practices that you can take on in your daily life to make sure that you're engaged and aware of what's going on with your mental wellness. But far too often, that isn't followed up on. Individuals don't like doing homework. I know I don't. So it's something that's often skipped over. Billing and insurance, I won't spend a lot of time on, but it's not uncommon for a therapist to spend as much or more time than on billing and insurance issues than with clients directly. when we talk about a supply-side constrained market with too few therapists to actually provide the services necessary, the last thing we really want is for them to be sitting in a room for several hours a day filling out paperwork. So I kind of touched on this along the way, but clients are very much bound by fear, fear of the unknown, fear of diagnoses following you for life. Something that we see in our business all the time is parents who don't want a diagnosis reported to their insurance company, right? Or they don't want a formal diagnosis given to their child because they're afraid it's going to limit their access to insurance at some point in their lives around a pre-existing condition. They're concerned that it's going to limit their opportunities going to college. They're concerned that it might have an impact on their desirability as a job applicant later in life. So there's a lot of fear there. Some of it very real. Some of it related to stigma that's developed over their lifetime. So as an industry, we've become very dependent on drug therapies. I think most of the evidence out there shows that a combination of drug and talk therapy is often the best route. But a variety of industry pressures, working styles and so forth, push those that can prescribe drugs down that path, right? You can see, 4, 8 clients an hour if you're just dealing with medication management. You can see exactly 1 if you're dealing with talk therapy. So there's some real challenges around dependence on drug therapy. And actually, just to go back there, telehealth, while really interesting, it's also helping to drive up that dependence on drug therapy, right? All too often, you contact a general practitioner, you tell them that you're dealing with some sort of mental health challenge, anxiety, depression, you name it. They respond by prescribing some sort of drug, right? The conversation lasts maybe 5 minutes. Sure. What's that? Sorry. So a lot of this data came from Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. Yep. So as we're running fairly short on time here, I'm going to jump into opportunities. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the challenges in the space. I should say, again, if I had all the answers, I would have solved them by now. So I'm really counting on a lot of you guys to walk away from this session, understand, what those challenges are, and really think about how, you can innovate to drive solutions. So some of the opportunities, I'm going to run through this really fast. Reactivating stagnant inventory. So this is really talking about how do we enable those therapists that are unable to work today to actually work and see clients. That might be that therapist licensed in California, living in Florida, providing telehealth services to clients in California. It could be, I'll give you a very real example of one of the therapists that works on our platform. She's semi-retired, lives in, lives in a motorhome, drives between her kids' houses at different times of the year, and is able to provide services. Those are hours that she's able to provide services to clients that otherwise were completely unavailable. Reducing time overhead for therapists so they can see more clients, less time on paperwork. At our company, we do a lot around artificial intelligence and machine learning to improve the quality of matching, to improve the quality of treatment plans, to lessen the amount of time that's used to generate those treatment plans, to summarize notes, those sorts of things. Providing self-help and education for those who are not yet ready to see a therapist, or maybe their issues are not severe enough that it really warrants seeing a therapist right away, lessening some of the challenges on the existing ecosystem. applying pressure on our elected representatives around easing some of the laws that affect this industry. I'm just going to run through a lot of this really fast since we are almost completely out of time, and just hit on telehealth really quickly. So I figured since we're in San Francisco, the chart was appropriate. But some of the benefits of teletherapy: one, physical contact is impossible. If you were to talk to insurance providers in this space, number one challenge and number one driver for cost of insurance has to do with inappropriate physical contact, whether it's intended or not. Preference, so talking quickly about teens and young adults. Overwhelmingly, those between 13 and 24 years old have stated that sitting across from a therapist in a physical environment can be challenging at the very least. One of the comments we hear a lot is sitting across from somebody that looks an awful lot like my mom makes it hard for me to talk openly about things like sex and drugs. With that said, we're absolutely not saying that teletherapy is the right solution for everyone, but it is part of a holistic solution set, especially given the way that teens and young adults approaches have changed. Comfort, I think I spoke briefly about as we went along. Freedom, so the ability to see a therapist whenever, where you are, whenever you need them. And this is particularly important, if it's 2 a.m. and you're somebody that deals with substance use issues, and you've had a bad day and you're walking past a bar. I guess 2 a.m. is a bad example. 1 a.m., that trigger could be really challenging for you. So having the ability to reach out to a therapist when you need to. Now, it may not be your regular therapist, but reaching out to somebody who understands what's going on with you, has access to your records, and can coach you through that moment. Again, we're completely out of time, so I'm just going to keep blowing through some of these slides. Going back to accessibility, 50 to 60% of the U.S. population living within rural areas with limited access to mental health care. Confusion about how to see a therapist, when to see a therapist, what therapist is right for you. Wait times can be really challenging. So I think the median wait time to see a therapist across the country right now is running close to 3 weeks, which is just too long, right? Especially when you're talking about things like anxiety, depression, substance use issues, and so forth. Really quickly, I'll talk about our company. Our mission is to provide hope and support for those in need by addressing the primary barriers to receiving care. We do this through a curated network of mental health professionals, as well as a teletherapy and self-care suite of tools. Some of the things that are quite unique, we're actually the only direct-to-consumer teletherapy provider that works with those under the age of 18. Our core market is 13 to 24 plus their families. We provide multi-user, multi-location technology, which is great for for families. It's great for couples. Really useful for really any situation where you need others to join the session, but they can't be physically together. This is a little bit about what it looks like. And just to close out, did we get what we wanted from this? So show of hands, any questions before I step off?
Give it up for Shawn Kernes.
Thanks, everyone.